So another issue I tend to come across quite a bit in terms of shaft alignment and swing length as a matchup is the inverse of that pattern, which is being very long and very laid off. The inverse of the previous pattern of being short and across that you just saw. So what is considered very long swing? I mean, at the end of the day, you know, whenever the shaft gets relatively parallel to the ground or even past that, that would be considered somewhat on the longer side. That's just a very simple visual you can look at. You know, when swing lengths get very long, it gets very problematic when the shaft angle gets too laid off because there's nowhere for the shaft to go but steeper on the way down. And as soon as that shaft is directionally trying to get in front of you, meaning more upright and steeper, you're going to end up in trouble. So visually, what that laid off position looks like would be the inverse of the last move, which would mean that, you know, the shaft angle pointing behind you at the top of the swing. So for me as a righty, that would mean pointing obviously in that direction. You know, if the shaft angle is something like this here, this golfer is likely to steepen the club 99 times out of 100 unless they do something with their body, in which case, yeah, you didn't steepen the shaft, but you compensated your pivot in order to prevent steepening the shaft. Are you really getting better as a golfer? You have to weigh the pros and the cons in that scenario. So you know, if there's a golfer on the PGA Tour, I can equate this type of movement pattern to, it would be a guy like Ricky Fowler. Ricky Fowler has a really, really long backswing, especially with his driver, and he tends to get the shaft very, very laid off at the top, and then from there, there's almost nowhere for the shaft to go. So as soon as the hands start to come down, the shaft angle actually steepens and gets more upright on him. And then from there, theoretically, this club is trying to get in front of his body, but he stalls out and jumps up. If you look at him, it has a lot of hand action at the bottom. So he has a lot of stalling and timing elements take place in his golf swing. And unfortunately, in my opinion, this is why he tends to have a big number come into play every tournament. Every now and again, he just throws out a double bogey because of a poor swing that just leads to either like a push cut or a low pull draw where he double crossed it or something like that. So why is this pattern problematic, right? This is obviously the reason for this video. When you get very long and very laid off, in theory, how can you shallow the club from a position where the shaft angle is already almost maxed out and how shallow it can get, right? In theory, being across the line also means more vertical, and being obviously laid off means more shallow, right? When the shaft angle gets too laid off at the top, especially for a longish backswing, the problem here is we tend to see a few tendencies that come up with a player who gets into that shallow spot. Number one, they tend to get very, very external on the trail shoulder. Now, maxing out your external rotation on the shoulder in the backswing is problematic because there's nowhere else for that shoulder to go then but more internal on the way down, right? When you peak the range of motion on a movement, how can you improve that movement on the way down? You can't. So unfortunately, if you're too external at the top of the backswing here, well, your only option from here is to start to separate that trail shoulder coming down and move it internally, which is going to steepen the club. And this is something that I see a lot. And again, with Ricky, we see exactly that move. Number two, when the shaft gets very, very laid off at the top, where do you want that shaft to go? Like I said, it's already almost peaking that range of motion as well, right? You can't continue to shallow the club from there. How do you expect to hit the golf ball doing that, right? If you're here and you try to shallow that shaft, I mean, can you make contact with the golf ball doing this? It almost seems ridiculous when you see it visually, right? You obviously cannot do that. And so what ends up happening is now the club is likely going to start to get steeper. And we see this almost guaranteed because as soon as these hands start to come down in the downswing, you are going to start to apply a downward force to the handle of this club. Okay? Because your hands have to come down to make contact with the ball. I mean, that's just common sense there. And so when you are very long and very laid off at the top, well, if you start to do this type of movement here, right, where the hands start to drop, that downward dropping is going to apply a force to the club, which is going to steepen the shaft, and obviously maxing the range of motion on those elements with the shoulder and the shaft position itself. Well, that's doubling up on the likeliness that you will steepen the shaft from there. So the shaft tends to come down very, very upright, almost like that. So if you theoretically were long and laid off and you tried to rotate, you would end up doing something like this here, and you got no chance from there. And so from there, either the golfer starts to steepen it early and then stands up and does something funky with the body, or they simply start to slide and tilt back right off the bat to keep the shaft in a shallow spot. Again, you're sacrificing your body's movement pattern. You're sacrificing your posture to try to correct the shaft movement. And so in a scenario like that, I would rather the shaft angle either be in line with the target or even a little bit across. It's not nearly as penalizing being slightly across the line on a longer swing because that golfer has a lot more time coming down to rearrange the shaft. Remember, that short and across position was deadly because this golfer has such little time before getting to the ball that they cannot reroute the shaft enough. Most golfers can't anyways. Whereas on the longer swing, right? If your swing is really long, you can rearrange the shaft either across or in line with the target. This golfer here has a lot more time now to get the shaft moving in the appropriate direction. And also being in line with the target or a little bit across now gives the player the actual space to be able to shallow this club. Whereas when you're very long and very laid off, you can't shallow the club. There's nowhere for the shaft to go. It ends up coming down steeper, which ends up creating a problem. So directionally, we need the shaft flattening out behind the player. If it's already too long and laid off, there's nowhere for the shaft to go, you're going to end up in trouble. So we'll, again, clarify how to correct that issue in the following videos, but I just wanted to explain, if you're looking at the backswing first, which is always a priority when you're looking at if the player is even able to shallow the club, well, short and across is deadly, long and laid off is equally deadly, just for a different reason.